Let's give a couple of minutes for people to join, and we will start in 1 minute. Okay, I think we can start. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Adapting Latin American Caribbean Airports to a Changing Climate. Today, we have the privilege of having our speaker, our friend, Rachel Burbidge, which representing the Manchester Metropolitan University and Eurocontrol, who has worked with us jointly on this project. As you are aware of the effects of climate change that is having in our region, having a significant impact in all kinds of infrastructures, such as airports, which are vital for our regional connectivity. So this is why we thought of having this webinar, and also to release it to the general public and to the press, if you are connected today, about this report that Rachel have produced based on the results of a survey that we circulated among our members, and appreciate it for those who have participated or contribute to with your answers, that it was intended to identify the effects of the climate change, especially in our airports. As said, Rachel will go deep into the results of the survey and the report itself. But before starting, we would like to remind you, as all the webinars that we produce and we have done in the past, we will have a simultaneous interpretation. You only need to go through the Zoom menu to the icon, the globe icon that says interpretation, and select your channel of your preference. As a recommendation, we always suggest people to select the last option that says mute original audio, to listen to either Rachel or Paul, our interpreter, instead of an overlap that could happen. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Rachel, and appreciate all your support producing this document that is of benefit for all our members. Sorry, Rachel, I forgot to mention something. The question, we will have a Q&A session after the presentation. We are not going to enable the chat for this, so we kindly ask you to send your question for Rachel either in English or in Spanish to the email address that you find on the screen, info@aci-lac.aero, and we will have the Q&A session at the end. So please remind to send the question for Rachel at this email address. And now we give you the floor to Rachel for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you very much to ACI-LAC for all the good collaboration on the study, especially to the ACI-LAC Environment Committee and all of the airports that supported the survey. Much appreciated. So good morning, buenos dias, bom dia, bonjour. It's really exciting to be here today to share the results of the study with you. And this is a project we've been working on with ACI Latin America and Caribbean and colleagues from the Manchester Metropolitan University for around 2 years now. And the objective of the study, as Francisco said, was really to try and understand what the effects and impacts of climate change will be for airports in the Latin America and Caribbean region, and what measures are needed to adapt and build resilience to those impacts. So I'm going to talk for probably about 20-25 minutes, and then there will be time for a Q&A. Next slide, please. So we know that the climate is changing and that the impacts of climate change are going to affect airports around the world. And we also know from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, that the climate is changing quicker than expected and that the effects are likely to be greater and more intense. So we really need to understand how we need to prepare for that. In the Latin American region and Caribbean region, there are major hub airports. There are airports that are important for regional and local economies. And there are many smaller airports that are vital for connectivity reasons. So it's really important to understand what the risks they might face might be and how to adapt and build resilience to them. So the first stage of the study was to understand what effects are projected for the Latin America and Caribbean region. And the IPCC designate 10 subregions, 10 climatic subregions in the Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see those listed at the right-hand side of the screen there. So the climate effects in each of the subregions will be slightly different. And again, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the different effects projected. And then in the map, in the hexagons, you can see the main climate effects expected in each subregion. So this will vary across the LAC region as a whole. And so the impacts for airports will also vary. But in general, in Central and Southern America, we're expecting higher temperatures. Some subregions will experience a decrease in precipitation. Some will experience an increase. But even in subregions that experience a decrease, there may be an increase in intense heavy rainfall events. In the Caribbean, there's projected to be an increase in extreme tropical cyclones, higher temperatures, and also a decrease in precipitation. And throughout the LAC region, in coastal areas, we're expecting to see a rise in sea levels. Next slide, please. So the second stage of the study was a consultation with airport professionals in the LAC region to try and gain their views on what they expect the impacts and effects to be, and to learn from their experiences of what they've already had to deal with. So this was carried out through a stakeholder survey. It was available online from November 2022 to March 2023 in English and Spanish. And the main questions we asked were what climate change impacts airports in the region are expecting, which do they think will be the biggest challenge, and what measures are they implementing or planning to adapt and build resilience to those impacts. So we had 35 responses from airports and airport groups, which covered 53 airports in total. And we had responses from all of the LAC subregions, apart from Southern South America and the American monsoon region. And you can see the breakdown of the responses on the screen there. Next slide, please. So the first thing we looked at were which climate change effects that airports are expecting to experience in the region. And you can see on the top bar of the chart there that the majority of airports that responded to the survey are already experiencing higher average and extreme temperatures. And the majority of the rest expect to experience them by about 2050. A similar picture for an increase in precipitation and an increase in storms. Over half of the airports are already experiencing these effects, and most expect to experience it by around 2050. For sea level rise, you can see it's a slightly different picture. This is generally a longer term effect, not always. And I think this is reflected here in that fewer airports are already experiencing this, but then in the medium to longer term, a much greater number do expect this to be an impact of concern. Similarly for business and economic effects. So with business and economic effects, we're covering things such as a change in tourism demand because of changing climatic conditions at a location, an increase in operating costs, an increase in insurance premiums. And here again, you can see it's not such a big concern at the moment, but looking out, even in the near term, it does start to become something that airports are expecting to experience. Next slide, please. So we wanted to drill down a bit and look and see if there are any regional differences in the effects experienced or expected. So 10 sub-regions was a little bit too much for some meaningful analysis. So we grouped the 10 sub-regions into 4 broader sub-regions, which you can see on the screen here, and they're listed on the right-hand side of the slide. So we tried to group sub-regions that have broadly similar current climates and climate projections. And the 4 groups we established are broadly similar to the ones used by the IPCC in their 5th assessment report, so their previous assessment report. Next slide, please. So you can see at sub-regional level, we do have some differences emerge. In Central America and the Caribbean, you can see that the majority of respondents are already experiencing higher average and extreme temperatures. Similarly, for storms and precipitation, it's already been experienced or expected more in the nearer term. Whereas in Western and Eastern South America, not so many respondents are experiencing these effects at present, but looking out to around 2030, 2050, particularly in East and South America, these effects are expected. A couple of other differences to pick up on. In Central America, a decrease in precipitation is already being experienced by the majority of respondents. And in Western South America, the effect that's already being most experienced is actually changes in fog occurrence. So climate change can either increase fog occurrence or it can decrease fog occurrence. And in this case, for the respondents, they were actually experiencing an increase in fog occurrence. Next slide, please. Great. So the next stage was to look at what some of the main impacts might be for the effects that we identified. So I'm going to focus on the impacts for airports from the 4 main climate change effects that survey responses identified. But in the actual report, we do look at the potential climate change impacts for all 11 of the effects covered by the survey. So for higher average and extreme temperatures, this can affect aircraft performance, particularly at takeoff. It can cause heat damage to runways or taxiways. It can cause heat damage to equipment, and it can exacerbate conditions for passengers and personnel, for example, through heat stress. Next slide, please. So for the respondents to the survey, you can see that the majority are already experiencing the need for an increase in cooling demand. And looking out into the future, they're also expecting indeed health impacts for passengers and employees, an increased fire risk and heat damage. Next slide, please. Storms are probably already the biggest cause of disruption for airports and the aviation sector. They can cause significant operational disruption. They can damage infrastructure. We have lightning strikes, and the heavy precipitation that often accompanies storms can, of course, flood infrastructure. Next slide, please. So I grouped together the results for the questions on the impacts for precipitation and storms here, because you can see that some of them are broadly similar. For example, flooding of infrastructure and disruption to operations. And you can see here that many of these impacts are already being experienced by airports today, even flooding of ground transport and damage to infrastructure. And most airports expect to experience this more looking out into the future. Next slide, please. And then finally, for sea level rise, as we mentioned, this is in most cases, not always, but in most cases, a longer term effect, and the impacts are longer term. But storm surge is already a very current effect. This can cause disruption to operations, permanent loss of capacity or infrastructure. And sea level rise in the longer term could lead to permanent damage or loss of capacity and infrastructure. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the impacts of sea level rise, which respondents are already experiencing or expecting. And you can see that they are already experiencing temporary flooding of infrastructure. More expect to experience this in the future, and also disruption to operations and flooding of ground transport is expected in the future. Next slide, please. Another key thing that we found was that the respondents do expect to experience a growing number of climate change effects over time. So at present, respondents, around 80% of respondents are already experiencing at least one effect of climate change. Looking out to 2030, that increases to 97%. And by 2050, all respondents are already experiencing at least one effect of climate change, with one expecting to experience up to 9 effects. Next slide, please. Again, though, we do see some regional differences. In Central America and the Caribbean, almost all respondents are expecting to experience, or already experiencing at least one effect of climate change. Whereas in Western South America and Eastern South America, there are more respondents that are yet to experience effects. But looking out to 2050, by then, all respondents in all sub-regions expect to experience at least one effect. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next stage was to understand from which of these effects the respondents expected to be the most significant challenge. And the difference here was that although an airport might be experiencing or expecting to experience an effect, it might be something that they could actually deal with, and it wouldn't be so much of a challenge. For example, if an airport was expecting higher average and extreme temperatures, but they already had a really good cooling system, natural ventilation in place, it might not be such a challenge. Or if an airport was expecting a metre of sea level rise, but they already had sea defences or natural barriers in place to protect against 1.5 metres of sea level rise, it might not be such a challenge. Here you can see that indeed there are a few differences between the effects being experienced and those that are expected to be the biggest challenge. The main one is that airports expect increase in frequency and intensity of precipitation to be the biggest challenge as compared to the most that expect to experience higher average and extreme temperatures. And then more or less, though, the main 4 are the same as the main 4 effects expected or experienced. So also sea level rise, an increase in frequency intensity of storms. And the 5th one in the row, general changes in weather patterns. This refers to things like an increase in extreme events or seasonal shifts in timing of events. Next slide, please. And then when it comes to the impacts that are expected to be the biggest challenge, I think this is very clear. Flooding is the impact which the majority of airports expect to be the biggest challenge. And this is actually followed by water scarcity. So I think the message here is probably that the key adaptation measures that airports need to be considering are for water management. So that's either to measures to increase drainage capacity, raise infrastructure to deal with an excess of water, or water management policies and processes to deal with insufficient water. Next slide, please. So general recognised industry good practice is to find out what climate impacts an airport might be at risk of or vulnerable to, is to carry out a climate change risk assessment. And this involves using climate projections and looking at the airport's assets and operations to identify what might happen, how likely is that to happen, and what are the consequences if it does happen. And then this can build up an overview or a picture of potential risks, which can then be used to identify the most urgent or the most critical to address. And for more information on this, there is guidance produced by ICAO, and its key steps for aviation organisations in risk assessment and adaptation planning, and that can be found on the ICAO website. Next slide, please. So we asked LAC airports about their engagement with climate change risk assessment, and you can see here that there is indeed already some engagement with the climate change risk assessment process. We had 5 airports at the time of the survey that had already carried out a climate change risk assessment, and 1 that was in the process of it, and 9 that were intending to. So you can see that there is some engagement here. And as the survey was carried out sort of nearly 2 years ago now, this has progressed a little bit. So I think it's encouraging to see that some action is being taken, but just perhaps maybe it needs to be accelerated a little bit because of the way climate change is accelerating. Next slide, please. So following a climate change risk assessment, good practice is usually to implement a climate change adaptation plan or strategy. So this involves identifying suitable adaptation measures to address specific climate change risks and vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. You can see here that there is a bit of a lag from the climate change risk as the stage that the airports are at with climate change risk assessments. And I think that is normal because risk assessment is the first stage in the process, and then the adaptation plan follows. So it's usual that more airports would be at the risk assessment stage in this sort of stage of the process. But you can see here there is still engagement with the process. 1 airport had carried out an adaptation plan or implemented an adaptation plan. 1 was in the process and 9 were intending to do so. But I think something that's interesting to pick up on here is that there were 10 airports that hadn't yet implemented an adaptation plan or strategy, but which had implemented ad hoc measures to address specific issues or challenges. And in some cases, these were quite significant or substantive measures that had been implemented, such as increasing drainage capacity, coastline, shoreline protection, or improving air conditioning systems. So I think, well, best practice would still always be to go through the full climate change risk assessment and adaptation planning process. In cases where this isn't possible, or where there is a more urgent or critical need to address an issue, then it is possible to implement specific ad hoc measures to address specific critical or urgent issues, as long as it's sort of based on good information and planning. Next slide, please. Okay, and here is an overview of some of the measures being taken by LAC airports that they are already implementing at the moment. So just around half of the survey respondents are implementing energy security and efficiency measures. And so this is really a win-win, because here there's the possibility to develop climate resilience, but also to contribute to decarbonisation targets. And then, as you might be expecting from some of the previous slides, the other main measures that are being implemented are measures to address flooding and increased drainage, and measures to address water security. And there's more detail on all of this in the report. Next slide, please. Okay. So the next thing that we wanted to understand were what were the biggest challenges for airports to engage with the climate change risk assessment and adaptation process. And you can see there is a clear front runner here, and that was lack of information or data. So this was both data on climate change effects, climate change projections to support risk assessments, and also lack of guidance on the actual risk assessment process itself. Survey participants identified a need for methodologies, examples of good practices, and case studies, for example. And many airports also emphasised the importance of having top management support in the process. Next slide, please. So the final part of the study was to look at the level of preparedness of airports in the region for climate change. And you can see, I think this is generally pretty positive, that around 70% of airports consider themselves to be slightly prepared or moderately prepared for the impacts of climate change. So this shows that some work is being done to start to prepare for these impacts. Only 21% considered that their airport was well or very well prepared. So I think there is still some work to be done. Perhaps it needs to be accelerated as climate change is accelerated. But I think that the general message is that airports are starting to engage with the process and take measures that are needed. Next slide, please. So getting close to wrapping up now, I think the key conclusions that we came out with is that we can see that the effects of climate change and the resulting impacts are a growing risk for airports in the region. And there is an increasing and accelerating need to adapt and build resilience to what might be ahead. But we can also see that airports in the region are starting to engage with risk assessment and adaptation planning, but perhaps some further action is needed to increase that action so as to reach for the best achievable levels of resilience in the region, and indeed for airports around the globe. So in collaboration with ACI-LAC, we came up with 5 key recommendations that we think could support airports in the region and indeed globally with the risk assessment and adaptation process. And one of these is to continue awareness raising efforts. ACI-LAC are already doing this, ACI World, ICAO and other organisations, but there is the potential for more measures to raise greater awareness of the impacts that may be ahead and the adaptation measures that are necessary. The second recommendation was coordination and collaboration. Again, this does already happen, but it can perhaps be expanded for perhaps sharing of good practices between airports in the LAC region, in other ACI regions and globally. And this could be through peer support, for example, meetings, workshops, and other similar fora. Next slide, please. We think that listening to what the airports that responded to the survey said, that we can do more to promote and support climate change risk assessment. So the survey very clearly demonstrated that airports would like to see more information and guidance, case studies, and perhaps opportunities for training such as workshops. And similarly, for the implementation of climate change adaptation measures, there was a call for more information and guidance, best practices, case studies, and other examples and opportunities such as workshops. And then finally, I think there is a place for engaging more with the research community to look at regionally focused research. There's a growing amount of research on climate change impacts for airports in the aviation sector in some other regions, such as North America, for example. But in the LAC region, there is really very little currently targeted research on climate change impacts and adaptation measures for airports or the aviation sector. So I think there's really a space there to engage with the research community to see what they could provide in terms of climate projections or studies and analyses. For example, there has been a study produced in Europe on the potential of higher average on extreme temperatures to impact aircraft takeoff performance at length limited island airports. And perhaps there might be value in a similar study in the LAC region, or perhaps studies on the potential impacts of sea level rise or higher average and extreme temperatures in general. So I think there's a lot of room there to coordinate with the research community. So that was the final recommendation. I'm going to leave it there. That was quite a quick run through of all the material in the report. So for a more in-depth look, you can download the report and look in more detail into some of the other sections. I just wanted to finish by sharing two things that we included in the report that we hope will be useful. And so for each of the 4 broader subregions, we have developed what we're calling a regional focus, which looks at a bit more depth at the subregion, climate effects, climate impacts, and potential adaptation measures. Next slide, please. And then the final part of the report is a directory of impacts and adaptation measures for LAC airports. So here we look at each of the 11 effects that we cover by the study. And for each effect, we identify what we think the key impacts might be for airports and what some of the potential adaptation measures might be and the subregions where that's applicable. So we hope that will be useful, possibly even more widely than the LAC region. And that's at the back of the report. And there is also a resource list as well. So next slide, please. So I'm going to leave it there for the presentation and say there's lots more detailed information in the reports themselves. And then I thank you very much, and I will hand back to Francisco to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Rachel, very much for the presentation, also for producing this important report for the region. We have received a question that was requesting information from a specific country. Just as a reminder that the analysis obviously was based on the responses from the airport that have participated in the survey, but there is no specific data by country, but rather by climate zone, as Richard just mentioned. I don't know if there is other studies in the sense you have mentioned that there probably could be or is a good opportunity, but there are little literature written on this. But the analysis that we could do was more on the regional perspective rather than by country or by sub-region. So yes, just to clarify that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We looked at it at sub-regional level rather than country level for several reasons, because as we've mentioned, the data just isn't always available at country level. So this is one of the data gaps that was picked up on in the study, and also for anonymity purposes, because if we'd looked at a more granular level, it may have been possible to identify particular airports. And so one of the conditions of the survey was that responses would be anonymous. But I do think there definitely is value in doing a deeper dive at country level to look at specific effects and impacts for a country or a specific airport, because of course even within a sub-region, the sub-regions are quite large and the effects will vary across the sub-region. So I think, as the person that asked the question suggested, definitely a good idea to do that kind of deeper country level look and analysis.
You, Rachel, and we also receive another question that says, what should be the main climatic variables that airport operators should analyze in order to follow up their monitoring on a systematic basis? I assume on climate change or identifying the effects.
That's a really good question. And also thank you to the person that asked the question for emphasizing the importance of the continuous monitoring of climate change effects and impacts and adaptation measures. So what I didn't pick up on in the presentation, it is in the graphics from the ICAO documents, but this is a really important step for two reasons, because the risk assessment is not a one-off process, because the climate can change differently or more quickly to the way it's projected, as we're already seeing, unfortunately. And also because there needs to be a process to check that the measures that are being, the adaptation measures that are being implemented are actually fit for purpose and achieving what is required, and if not, whether there need to be some changes made there. So that was a really good point. In terms of what are the main effects to monitor, I think that is a really regional and airport specific question. I mean, we saw that for many of the airports in the survey that higher average and extreme temperatures or an increase in precipitation were the main effects of concern, and so likely to have the biggest impacts at the airports and be the ones to be monitored and tracked. But then we saw, for example, in one of the regions, a decrease in precipitation was quite a big effect, or in one of the regions that there was more concern about fog, for example. So I think once the initial, well, to start with, you can get an idea of what the key sort of climate change effects will be by looking at the IPCC information, so you can see what's relevant for your region. But then the next important step is the specific risk assessment for the airport, because as I think we mentioned, just because an effect will occur doesn't necessarily mean it will be a challenge for the airport. So then you need to identify which are the key climate variables of concern for the airport and that you need to take action on, and then they would be the key ones to focus on for the monitoring. So apologies, I can't say it's A, B, C, or D, but it will be very airport specific, but I hope that gives an indication.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. There's another question that just came in, that if we see that the airports are paying attention to the effects of climate change and there is commitment, I would say yes, and probably depends on the sub-region. It's obvious that in the Caribbean, airports might be more vulnerable because they are in the coastline, rather than the others that might be in a different situation. But it's true that, and I have participated in a similar meeting in Europe, that they have the same problem. Raising awareness to the top management might not be easy, but we do see a commitment from the airports in the region. But we have to continue, as part of the recommendation that Rachel included in the report. We have to continue raising awareness on this, especially with top management, on the importance of doing these kind of risk assessments. I don't know if you want to complement, Rachel.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I entirely agree. I mean, this particular report focuses on the Latin America and Caribbean region, but from working with airports in many regions, I can tell you that the challenges are broadly similar, and that is the awareness, the getting the top management support, the getting the data, understanding what the effects and impacts might be. So I think we are, thanks to work of organisations like ACI-LAC who are working to raise awareness, and also, as Francisco said, perhaps because of the effects and impacts that airports themselves are experiencing, we are seeing growing engagement with this. But it's but also, of course, and we see this everywhere, there are also competing challenges, competing concerns, competing priorities. So it's about, sort of, as Francisco said, raising awareness with the airport, and then the the responsible person in the airport raising the awareness with the top management to try and initiate these processes. But in general, I think it's positive to see how in pretty much every region there is more and more awareness growing and engagement with this.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, for the moment, we have not received, but I was thinking that perhaps we can include, apart from the link for the recording of this webinar, as well as the reports, we can also include the report that you were mentioning from ICAO for those who have not, who don't have it. So we can include it there, and you can take a look as well to the other documentation that we can share with you on climate resilience. I don't know.
Oh, sorry, Francisco.
No. It was I just received one, but yeah, you can go ahead before going to the question.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good idea. And also this is quite a lot of information squashed into a limited presentation. So if people go away and look through the report and digest all of the information, and then if they have follow-up questions afterwards, please feel free to get in touch with me. Because if you're anything like me, you always think of your best questions about 10 minutes after the webinar is finished. So.
Yeah, it normally happens, and we will share with you. We have received another one that says, and I think it's a reference to the document or the presentation, that says 76% of airports are slightly or moderated prepared to take an engagement. What would be the reasons for airports for not taking more adaptation plan or measures? It could be budget, could be not staff skill, external support needed.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's all of those and many more, and there can be competing priorities. For example, decarbonisation is a very big issue at the moment, and many airports have very ambitious decarbonisation targets that they're putting a lot of resource into. So perhaps the other side of the coin doesn't get looked at so much. So it can be limited resources. It can be limited awareness, although we do hope that that is growing. And it can be just having the sort of the correct or the necessary skills and expertise in-house, because it is a very specific skill set to do a detailed climate change risk assessment, or having access to someone that can do that for you, having access to the data. So I think there are a multitude of reasons why airports perhaps are not able to engage to the extent they would want to with climate change adaptation. But I think we are seeing in all regions over recent years that is starting to change, and the importance of climate adaptation is starting to rise up on airports' agendas. So I think it's definitely moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Rachel. We have another one, and I think will be the last one, but you can keep sending your questions, and we will share it with Rachel, and we will reply offline. But there is one question that currently are two, actually are two. The first one, it says, can you tell us a bit more about solution to implement? And the other one is asking about what you think about nature-based solutions.
Okay, great. Good questions. So solutions to implement, there are a vast number of solutions that it's possible to implement, depending first on what the effect is and what the impact is, and how that impact affects the specific airport, what measures the airport already has in place, also to a certain extent what the airport's risk tolerance is, for example, for having operational disruption. If the airport maybe the airport has a small number of flights, and so it's not a such an issue if the airport needs to close for a couple of hours because of a weather event. But if the airport is operating close to or at full capacity, then this, of course, then is much more of a challenge because the disruption is greater and the recovery time is greater. So there's a certain amount of risk tolerance involved in there as well. And that's why we tried, and of course, resource availability. So that's why we tried to develop this sort of directory so that we could present different options for adaptation measures. So if, for example, let's take sea level rise, your airport is at risk of a certain amount of sea level rise, then you might be able to allow a safe amount of inundation. If all safety standards were still being met, you might be able to have a safe amount of flooding. You might need to consider measures such as increasing drainage, putting in water pumps, or raising infrastructure. You may need to consider moving part of the airport infrastructure. And in very extreme cases, there are 1 or 2 cases where this is happening with smaller airports, not necessarily for sea level rise, but it might be necessary to relocate the airport. So we kind of tried to provide this scale of measures so that you can look at it and say, right, this is the problem I've got, these are the resources I've got, or this is the adaptation capacity I've got, what measures are suitable for us as an airport according to our business plan, our strategy. And then for nature-based solutions, yes, definitely. So this is using, where you can, natural solutions to address climate change adaptation. So natural solutions for absorbing water, for green roofs, for example, or natural barriers to protect against sea level rise, such as mangrove. So I think definitely very, very much an important adaptation measure to be considered where possible. So yeah, great. Thank you for the questions.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Rachel, we have not received more questions, but as said, you can continue sending your question and we will address it offline. Also, as a reminder, we will share the recording of this webinar, the link to download the report that was produced by Rachel and ACI-LAC, and also the others that were included in the presentation for you to have it. You can also find the report on our website, so you can access our website and find it there. But if we don't have any further questions, I really want to thank Rachel for all your support over the years, not only for this report itself, and based on the recommendation, that's something that we have to discuss it internally, both with the committee, the environmental committee, and also with the management to address this topic is to continue raising awareness especially with the top management on the importance of starting looking at this and also to produce this climate risk assessment. So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to give a final words, but from our side, really thank you for all your support.
No, from my side as well, thank you very much, like you say, for the good collaboration, not just on this report, but over the years on various different projects as well, and to the Environment Committee and all of the airports that contributed to the survey. It's really very much appreciated. It's great to see the report out there. And yeah, great opportunity to be here today. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions, of course, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So everyone, you will receive all the documents as mentioned, and have a nice day. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.